Please note, Night Terrors is for a mature audience only. Episodes may contain violent images and extreme gore.
Ah, you've come back again, have you? I can see it in your eyes. Curiosity, hunger, a little bit of greed. Well, you're in luck. I've got just the tale to satisfy your cravings. But be warned, this story is not for the faint of heart, for it's about a hunger so powerful it can consume even the most careful of souls. It's a story about appetites, about taking more than you deserve, and about what happens when you bite off more than you can chew. For this is the tale of the eternal feast.
The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the modest farm. The small plot of land nestled at the edge of the forest was humble but well kept, with a few rows of crops, a chicken coop, and a goat lazily chewing on grass near the barn. The chickens clucked softly, pecking at the dirt, while the old goat, with a patchy coat of fur, wandered near the fence. In the distance, a mule snorted as the farmer loaded the last of the season's harvest into a worn wooden cart. The farmhouse itself was simple but sturdy, built by the farmer's own hands. Inside, the warm smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, and a pot of stew bubbled gently over the hearth. It was a peaceful life, though not without its struggles. The farmer, a kind man with calloused hands and a tired smile, worked from dawn until dusk to keep the farm afloat. But no matter how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. Standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, his wife watched him with worry etched across her face. She was a striking woman, though time and hard work had softened her features. Her long, dark hair was tied back with a cloth, and her hands were rough from tending to the farm alongside her husband. They were happy together, but the debt they owed to the landowner hung over them like a storm cloud. The landowner was a man of wealth and power, a lecherous figure whose gaze lingered far too long on the farmer's wife whenever he came to collect the rent. The couple leased the land from him, and they were behind on their payments. No matter how much they scraped together, it never seemed to satisfy him, and lately, his demands had become more than just financial. The wife recalled the last time the landowner had visited. He'd ridden up to the farm on his horse, a cloud of dust rising in his wake, as if the very ground rejected him. The moment he dismounted, his eyes were on her, raking over her form with a predatory gleam. The farmer had been away in town, leaving her alone on the farm. It was a visit she tried hard to forget.
"I'm sure we can work something out," he had said, his voice dripping with false sympathy.
He'd leaned in too close, the stench of sweat and wine on his breath, as his hand brushed against her waist, lingering far longer than it should have.
"After all, it's not just the crops I'm interested in."
She had jerked away, her face flushing with anger and disgust, but the landowner had only chuckled. His hand slid from her waist to her arm, his fingers curling around her waist with just enough pressure to let her know he could take what he wanted if he chose to.
"Such a shame for a woman like you to waste away out here on this farm,"
he had mumbled, his voice low and oily.
"You could live quite comfortably if you were willing to be a bit more reasonable."
His eyes had flicked to the farmhouse, his smirk deepening. "After all, we all have debts to pay, don't we?" The wife had pulled away, barely able to contain her rage, and the landowner had simply smiled. "Think it over," he had said, his eyes narrowing as he turned to leave. "Maybe next time we'll come to a more satisfying arrangement." The wife shuddered at the memory. His words clung to her like a stain she couldn't wash away, and each visit only grew worse. It wasn't just the debt that weighed on them now. It was his lust, his relentless advances. She knew he wouldn't stop, not until he'd taken everything from them, including her. "I don't trust him," she said quietly, watching as her husband tightened the last strap on the cart. Her gaze flickered towards the edge of the farm, where the landowner's estate loomed on the horizon like a black mark against the sky. The farmer sighed, brushing the sweat from his brow as he joined her at the door. "I know, but what choice do we have? I'll sell what I can and hope it buys us some time." Her lips tightened, and she lowered her voice. "He's gonna come while you're gone. You know he will." The farmer frowned, his concern deepening. He glanced back at the house, then reached out to cup her chin gently in his hand. "There's a shotgun in the corner by the hearth," he said. "If he comes back and tries anything, don't hesitate. Use it." The wife nodded, her throat tight. She appreciated the gesture, but she knew the shotgun wouldn't solve their real problem. The landowner didn't want their money anymore. He wanted her. And the gun might scare him off once, but he would come back. Men like him always do. The cart rattled down the road, disappearing into the distance as her husband left for the town. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching until he was out of sight. But her mind was already working, turning over the events of the past few months and the growing threat that loomed over them. Inside the house, her gaze fell upon a small locked chest in the corner of the room. A chest she hadn't opened in years, not since she'd married the farmer and vowed to leave her past behind. Her family had practiced witchcraft for generations. Her mother and grandmother had been powerful witches, but the price of that power had been steep. She remembered her mother's skin, cracked and brittle like dry earth, and her grandmother's blackened teeth, her body wasting away under the weight of years of spell work. Witchcraft always took its toll, draining the body, leaving it hollow and frail. She had watched it happen to the women before her, and had sworn it wouldn't happen to her. But now, with the landowner's lecherous advances and their crushing debt pressing down on them, she knew there was only one way to protect her family. With trembling hands, she unlocked the chest and opened it. Inside were the tools of her trade, a mortar and pestle, dried herbs, and a leather-bound book filled with ancient spells and curses. She stared at the contents for a long time, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. But there was no other choice. Tonight, she would use the magic she had sworn never to touch again. That evening, after the farmer had left for town, the wife sent word to the landowner, inviting him to dinner. She knew what he wanted, and she knew how to give it to him, on her terms. The landowner arrived just after the sun dipped below the horizon, his horse kicking up dust as he rode toward the farmhouse. He dismounted with a swagger, his eyes gleaming with hunger, not for food, but for her. She greeted him at the door, her face calm and composed, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I've been thinking," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I know what you want." His eyes lit up with greedy anticipation, and he followed her into the house, his gaze never leaving her. "I knew you'd come around eventually," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. She stood before him, her eyes dark and serious. "I will give you what you want," she said, her voice steady despite a rage bubbling beneath the surface. "You'll have your way with me tonight, but in return, you will forgive our debt completely and sell this land to us at a fair price. After tonight, you will never come back here again." The landowner's lips curled into a hungry smile. He stepped closer, his fingers itching to touch her. But then the smell hit him, rich, savory scents that filled the room and clung to the air, wrapping around him like a seduction of its own. He glanced at the table behind her, laden with roasted meats, breads, pies, and vegetables, each dish more decadent than the last. His stomach rumbled audibly. "Well, well, well, what have we here?" he said, licking his lips. "It would be a shame to let all this go to waste now, wouldn't it? Once I've had my fill of food," his eyes flickered to her, glinting with malice, "then I'll have my fill of you." The landowner sat down, his eyes barely leaving her as he reached for a plate. But once his fingers closed around the nearest slab of roasted meat, his attention shifted entirely. He tore into the food, barely pausing to breathe as he chewed. Grease ran down his chin as he stuffed his mouth, the juices dripping onto the table as he tore at the meat with his teeth. He devoured everything within reach, stuffing his mouth with reckless abandon. The more he ate, the more ravenous he became. His teeth tore through slabs of meat with an obscene ferocity, his hands shoveling food into his mouth as though he hadn't eaten in weeks. Grease slicked his chin and dripped down onto his clothes, staining his once fine waistcoat. His breath came in short, ragged bursts between each grotesque mouthful. The wife stood at the side of the room, her eyes dark, watching him closely. She set down dish after dish as he devoured the contents of the table, his belly swelling with each bite. He gorged himself on bread, the crusts flaking off into his lap as he crammed entire loaves into his mouth without pause. His face glistened with sweat, the effort of his unrelenting hunger written in the way his body shook as he leaned forward for more. But as she watched, something strange began to happen. The spell was working, revealing the truth beneath the illusion. To the landowner, the food was the most exquisite he had ever tasted. Roasted meats, tender vegetables, rich pies, and sweetbread. But to the wife, the illusion faded, showing her the reality of what he was truly consuming. The thick, juicy slabs of meat he tore into with such greed weren't meat at all. They were lumps of dirt and grass, filthy and sodden from the farmer's ground. His fingers dug into pies filled with nothing but animal droppings. The manure smeared across his lips and face as he stuffed it into his mouth, moaning with delight as though it were the finest pastry. He gnawed on branches, chewing on bark and rotting wood as if it were roasted vegetables, each bite accompanied by a satisfied grunt. His hands dipped into a bowl of what he believed to be gravy, but was nothing more than stagnant water mixed with mud. He slurped it down, brown droplets splattering across his already soiled shirt, his eyes rolling back in his head with grotesque pleasure. The sickening sound of him chewing through muck and filth filled the room as he groaned with gluttonous satisfaction, completely oblivious to what he was really consuming. His stomach swelled obscenely, pressing against the strained fabric of his clothing. The buttons of his waistcoat popped one by one, clattering onto the floor as his belly expanded, hanging low and heavy over his belt. His breathing grew more labored, wheezing through his teeth as he continued to eat, shoveling dirt and waste into his mouth, thinking it to be a lavish feast. The wife stood still, her fingers cold as she clasped them together, the spell working perfectly. She could see the landowner for what he truly was, a grotesque, gluttonous man, his body bloated with the filth of the farm, his mind too clouded by hunger and greed to realize what was happening. His eyes were wild, his hands trembling as he reached for more, even as his body groaned under the strain of his insatiable appetite. He leaned back in his chair, his swollen stomach gurgling ominously, his breath coming in short gasps. But even then, he reached for another handful of what he believed to be rich roasted vegetables, only to shove a mound of animal dung into his mouth. He chewed greedily, the bitter, earthy taste twisted by the spell into something sweet and savory. The wife's voice was cold as she whispered, "You've had enough." But he couldn't stop. His body convulsed, his swollen belly heaving as he continued to stuff more filth into his mouth, chewing and swallowing with wild abandon. His face turned red, then purple, as a sickening crack echoed through the room. His stomach lurched and his limbs began to tremble violently. Then came the first snap. His fingers, still clutching at the dirt, twisted grotesquely, bending and cracking as his nails thickened into sharp black hooves. His legs jerked beneath the table, the bones twisting and snapping as his feet tore free of his boots, curling into stubby hooves. His skin, slick with sweat and grease, began to bristle, coarse patches of hair sprouting along his arms and legs, spreading up his neck and across his distended belly. The landowner let out a squeal, a horrible animalistic sound as his jaw unhinged with a wet, sickening pop. His face elongated into a snout, his nostrils flaring as his teeth grew blunt and crooked, tusks erupting from his gums. His beady eyes bulged, rolling back in his head as his tongue lolled from his snout, drool dripping onto the floor as his body convulsed with the transformation. His clothes tore as his body expanded, his stomach sagging grotesquely onto the floor, pink and bristled with wiry hair. His legs, now thick and stumpy, kicked helplessly beneath him as his arms shrank into stubby limbs, the transformation now complete. He was no longer a man, but a massive, hulking hog, squealing and thrashing in the remains of the filth that he had been devouring. His snout rooted through the muck on the floor, still searching for more, even as his bloated body rolled helplessly from side to side. The animalistic sounds of his squeals filled the room, his beady eyes wild with panic as he realized, too late, what had happened. The wife stood over him, her expression calm, her dark eyes glinting with satisfaction. "You always were a pig," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Now, the world can see that too." The next morning, the farmer returned, tired but hopeful. He had sold what he could at the market, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. As he stepped through the door, he was greeted by the sight of his wife smiling, her face radiant with pride. "Don't worry about the debt," she said. "The landowner has forgiven it. Not only that, he's given us a great gift, a big, fat hog, big enough to feed us for months." The farmer's eyes widened as he looked out into the yard, where the massive hog snorted and rooted in the dirt. That's incredible," he exclaimed, embracing his wife. "How did you manage it?" She smiled, resting her head on his chest. "Let's just say I gave him a dinner he won't soon forget." The farmer, oblivious to the truth, laughed and kissed his wife on the forehead. "You're a miracle worker," he said. "I love you." But as the farmer turned to admire the hog that would feed them for months, the wife stepped back into the house, feeling a strange ache in her limbs. As she passed by the mirror, she caught her reflection and froze. Her dark hair, once rich and vibrant, now held several streaks of gray, her skin paler than it had ever been before. Deep lines etched themselves around her eyes and mouth, as if years had been taken from her all at once. Her hand trembled as she touched her face, the realization settling in. The toll of the spell had been greater than she'd imagined. She smiled again, but this time the smile was thin, strained. Magic always had its price.
Ah, a happy ending, wouldn't you agree? Debt erased, and a feast that just keeps on giving. You see, my friends, hunger can be a powerful thing. It can drive men to their doom, to take more than they deserve, and in the end, it can turn them into the very thing they fear most. But as our clever wife learned, magic has a price, and it always collects. So, the next time you sit down to a hearty meal, be sure to savor every bite, because you never know when you might just bite off more than you can chew. Until next time, sweet nightmares.